I'm Tom James, Provost of Teachers College, and I have with me today some intellectual companions, and we're going to be talking together and with you about new research on learning and what impact that can have on teaching and how teachers can make use of that. We're going to do this a little bit differently. We're not going to use PowerPoint. We're going to talk more like a round table, and a round table with you, and it's a change of pace just to kind of wake up a little bit. And they're not using PowerPoint, but I'm assuming that there's a lot of power in their points, so you're going to be able to get a lot from it. They have tremendous reserves of video and scientific findings and things like that, but we're not going to treat this like an academic conference. I'm going to try to get them to talk about the work and talk with you and also talk about the relationship that we have with teachers. I just want to make a couple of framing comments, and these are things that are really obvious, so I'm just going to put them in my own words. Along with all of the wondrous developments that we heard about this morning and ways of thinking about teacher preparation, modeling of intensive practices, the specificity of those practices, there's another thing going on in these universities that we're part of, in this one, in Michigan, and others that you're connected with, and that is there's this great blaze of new knowledge that's coming through. One of the most prolific eras that we have known in research into human learning, into the brain, into genetics, into a lot of the social interactive components of how human beings interact with one another and also with technology. A great blaze of new knowledge is taking place, much more than we had seen earlier in our careers, and it's accelerating. So that this is happening here, it's happening in Michigan, it's happening at UCLA, it's happening in Illinois. What is the connection between that knowledge generation and the work that teachers and students and educators do in classrooms? That's really kind of what we're asking here. It's not something that's going to be taught in rarefied, codified, disembodied ways. It needs to be connected specifically with how we work with students in learning. And so we have some people here today, my intellectual companions, as I've called them, who are working in the science and in the research of this, but they're also interacting with teachers, and they're also working with teacher educators. I'll just start with an example. Herb Ginsburg holds an endowed chair at Teachers College. Recently was an author on a National Academy of Sciences report on the new science of what we know about early learning of mathematics. Herb also teaches teacher educators. He teaches directly, works with them, and he's out in the schools. His graduate students are out in the schools in Harlem, working with students in various settings. So he has this kind of amphibious nature of working in the science-based work of the academy, but also deeply engaged in practice and also in working with teachers. Karen Froud is in speech pathology and neuroscience, and is doing work in clinics and in school environments, also in Cambodia and Bolivia, and is working very, very directly in sites of practice, but also has a neurocognition and language lab, which is doing deep work in how the brain works and how we are engaging the learning of language. So she's another person that's crossing over between these environments. John Black holds another of our endowed chairs at Teachers College, and he's the head of our Institute on Learning Sciences, and is doing work on human interaction with technology. He's doing a lot of work on gaming environments, new kinds of curricula, multimedia engagement with the way that people learn. And he comes out of a cognitive psychology and cognitive science perspective. But he and his students are also working directly with development of curricula and with assistive technologies for students in schools and many other aspects that really connect with what teachers are doing. Fritz Mosher has a long history of working with developing projects that can help teachers and schools and learning in the foundation world, many years at Carnegie Corporation, more recently advising a number of organizations. He's here at Teachers College in Columbia with the Consortium for Policy Research on Education, and has been doing work on the research side, but also in developing models of learning progressions that can be applied to curricula in schools so that we can really begin to see the connection between the research and ways that people learn. I've told you all I know now, so what I'm going to do is try to get them engaged in talking with you. I'm going to pose some questions to them. I'm going to do some things along the way to try to open it up so you can also state your views, share your knowledge, and ask questions of them. But I want to begin, let me begin with Fritz Mosher, because he's been doing work recently that's picking up some of the major funding coming out of NSF. NSF has been doing a lot of funding, as IES has been, that's really going into this basic research, but also trying to understand how do you translate that so it really becomes applicable to practice at a high level in terms of policy and curriculum development, but then also teacher practice in the way we were talking this morning. Can you just begin and tell us a little bit of what you're doing and get us going?
Since I don't advance knowledge, I kibitz on the advancement of knowledge that other people are doing. The one form of this kibitzing takes the form of a focus on learning progressions, which is relevant to this meeting because it grew out of the CPRI's interest in promoting, with some funds from Hewlett, promoting the idea of adaptive instruction, formative assessment. And learning progressions are, in principle at least, a kind of metaphor for what you would want to have as a basis for doing that, for an adaptive, if teachers are going to adapt their instruction to where students are in the course of their learning, you obviously have to have in your head some model of how it is that learning progresses. And so we've been looking widely at people who are working on one or another form of that metaphor in science and mathematics in particular, although we've also begun to look at how that plays out in English language arts. And I think in some ways I'd like to wait to hear what the advances are so that I can comment on them, but my feeling is that this work is it's obviously useful in principle and practice. There's just a lot to learn, and I know more about what we don't know, I think, so far, and how long it's going to take to learn it than I feel ready to say about what's immediately available for practice. Although Herb and the others have some really good examples in math and in some other areas where I'm not sure Herb would even use the term learning progression, but understanding the way kids' thinking develops is certainly what they're about. And finding ways then to communicate, to work with teachers to understand what that might mean to them and how they could use it, I think is central to what we're talking about today.
My area has to do with children's mathematical thinking. There's been a lot of research on this over the past 30, 40 years now. And we've learned an awful lot about how kids think within the academic setting, within schools. This knowledge is really new. People did not have much of any insight into kids' thinking before that. And the knowledge that we have about kids is not general in the sense that, oh, he's a high math person, or she is weak in number skills. Those are vague. That's the level at which a lot of conversation takes place. But what the new research can do is give teachers and other people a lot of specificity about how kids deal with addition problems, or what are their misconceptions about fractions. So if you have that kind of knowledge, that really does a lot for you. For one thing, it tells you what to look for when the kids are trying to learn the material. You don't look just for did they get it right or wrong. That's often very misleading. Often some wrong answers are fascinating based on interesting reasoning. So it gives you a lot of very specific things to look for. And I think it ought to be at the center of teacher training, teacher professional service, professional development, pre-service. So if you don't understand the kids, my hypothesis is you cannot teach very well. You care about the rest of it. You can learn some practices that appear to be interesting, but they may or may not work with specific children. So I start with a child as the center of the world, center of the teaching world, around which everything else should revolve.
It's so interesting to have this chance to hear from my esteemed colleagues about their perspectives. And interesting, too, about the ways that we are similar and the ways that we're different in our approaches to this. I work in neuroscience. So my lab is called the Neurocognition of Language Lab, and I work on brain imaging experiments where we look at not just language, although that's my specialty, but on different kinds of learning across the lifespan. So we work with very young children right through to senior adults. And we also look at situations where people have difficulties with learning speech and language, with acquiring their first language, or learning later in life, acquiring different kinds of knowledge and skills. Sometimes the disabilities that we look at are developmental ones, and sometimes they're acquired. So, for instance, we'll look at adults post-stroke and how they manage to acquire skills again. Or we'll look at children with developmental learning disorders, such as speech apraxia, for instance. It's interesting to think about Herb's comment that we start with the individual child and think about what do we know about that child and how can that inform our practices for helping that child to acquire the knowledge and skills that they need. I feel like because I come from neuroscience and we're trying to acquire the kind of scientific knowledge that will help us understand how individuals' brains function, and then how we can use that knowledge to help us understand how those individuals do acquire cognitive skills and other kinds of skills too. But we're at the stage where we have to look not at each individual as different. We're looking for the commonalities, for the ways that all brains handle these kinds of tasks. Because if we don't do that work first, then we can't develop the theoretical frameworks that will allow us to formulate hypotheses that will tell us in turn how individual cases might differ from the more typical situation. So the genesis of neuroscience and education, it's really kind of a relatively new idea that we can talk to each other in these ways. And the promise and potential is that there will be this very fruitful dialogue, that neuroscience can be used to help us inform educational practices and to evaluate how effective our educational practices are. But from the neuroscience side of things, it's like we've got to do the basic work first, right? We need those theories, we need those frameworks, we need the basic knowledge to help us inform ways to move forward. So I feel like it's very complementary to the work that the other people at this table are doing.
As Tom mentioned, I come from a cognitive science background. I'm involved generally in applying basic cognitive research and results to education and improving learning in education in particular. Mm-hmm. And there's been last few years, there's been this very active area of basic cognitive research that has enormous promise, I think. That's developed called embodied or perceptually grounded cognition. It's a whole new perspective. And some of the stimulus for this, a lot of results have been around for a number of years. In fact, I was a little startled to find an article I published in 1979 cited as part of this approach. I never thought about it that way until recently. And so I've been doing this all my career. I just didn't know it, and now I found out. But it's really been brought before with the kind of neuroimaging results that Karen does and others, where many of the tasks that the cognitive researchers thought were involved a sort of abstract or symbolic style of thinking, actually, if you really have understood this area, also involve the perceptual areas of the brain and basically creating a perceptual simulation of the phenomena. Even simple things like retrieving properties of objects when asked about it, then not only will the areas that are would be a search of a symbolic network to retrieve the property involved, but also the visual areas, and also you're like visualizing the thing too, and so forth. And when you're processing language, you're sort of laying out the, if it's a narrative, for instance, the spatial layout of the thing in some fuzzy form, even with very minimal language input, and kind of tracing what's happening in there. You're not just processing the language and extracting the ideas in there. And that's actually what this paper in '79 showed. If we turn this into looking at learning, and this is what we've been doing, our group and just a few others at this point. Then the question is, how do we, when people are learning new things, how do we develop this perceptual simulation so that once they've done that, then what they're learning really becomes a part of them and the way they interact with the world. I think an embarrassment for education is a lot of what people learn in educational settings is just the surface. It's very shallow. It's not really a part of the way they think about the world. It hasn't become a part of them. And I think this embodied approach provides a framework for thinking about how to do that. You learn something in a classroom, people go out in a different setting, it never occurs to them to use that knowledge, okay? We see that in our own programs here at TC, where like in our program, the Department of Human Development, they take 4 statistics courses, they collect their own data, they haven't a clue how to apply the stuff in those courses to it. It hasn't really become part of them. When it really becomes part of them is when they actually do that. They analyze their own data. They then embodied the knowledge. It becomes a part of the way they think about the world. So how to create learning environments, and as Tom mentioned, I use a lot of technology to do that. But that's not the only way to do it. How does one develop these kind of perceptual simulations and coordinate that with the more symbolic way of understanding things that we more normally get in school, so there's a kind of a deeper understanding and application of the knowledge. And there is kind of a progression involved. Fritz's learning progressions involved in this. And I think when one's learning something, this is what our evidence shows. First you build up and are visualizing and mentally simulating things. And then with practice, it gets converted into a symbolic form. It gets a lot faster. But you need that perceptual simulation based upon experience in order to fall back on. So shuttling back and forth is the sort of key thing there between the 2 different forms of reasoning. So because you can use that experiential-based stuff, perceptual simulation-based stuff to figure out new ways of understanding, doing things different from the things you've learned procedures for as you sort of go along. So there is that kind of progression of fading out of the mental simulation to procedures and then being able to go back and forth when necessary, and you get new kinds of problems. The technologies that are being developed these days really are helping us do that. Gesture-based interfaces, like with the tablet computers and things, are a godsend for having to do this, because you're able to, with the movement of your fingers and stuff, to express some of this perceptually based stuff. You get the visual, you get the movement, you get the sound, all there, and having that kind of a learning experience really helps us work. That's much richer in terms of perceptual experience than the traditional computer-based stuff that we've had. Okay, I'll stop there for now, I guess.
So I'm going to make a couple of comments to keep things going here. One is about the nature of our panel, which I should have mentioned at the beginning. We have 2 other panelists who were casualties of the weather. They didn't get out of Chicago yesterday because the airport closed. Jim Pellegrino and Susan Goldman. We're very sorry they're not here. They're sort of invisible partners with us in this, and we hope that we can connect some of what's going on today with them in future dialogue. My second comment is kind of a silly one, but I'm going to use it as a challenge to my intellectual companions. In the 19th century, if you can imagine this image of some of the people who were school founders in the expanding United States, one of the school chiefs rode out on horseback with donkeys following and objects strapped to the back of these donkeys to explain to the farmers in the local communities why they needed schools, why they should tax and build schools. And the objects on those donkeys were blackboards. And so they were going to the people and, showing them the blackboards and talking about, teaching and building a school. And of course, they'd have to begin taxing themselves, and there was a lot of opposition to that. And this is one of the stories of the expansion of mass schooling in the United States in the 19th century. So Herb, you think of people who are wondering, what is all this newfangled stuff? There's this research going on. It's very expensive. There's a lot of, in a sense, sentiment in the country right now about spending money on things. And there's also a lot of teachers that are doing their work already. And we're here with our on horseback with our burros, and we've got neuroscience and cognitive psychology and all this stuff. When you're teaching students in your class, and you're working with the teacher education students, what are you giving them? What are the tools that you're giving them? Give us an example of something that is valuable in a practical and specific way for somebody that's going to be a teacher.
Okay.
Wow.
It's not simple. I think the most fundamental, I'll answer this on two levels. One is teachers need to have an orientation toward teaching that stresses understanding children and how they think. So you need that broad attitude to start with. So on top of the donkey is a bag which contains the strong motivation to understand kids. That's one thing. But what does understanding kids mean? It means you have some ideas about how they function, and you are able to relate those ideas to what happens in the classroom. So it's not only inspiration, it's some specific ideas. If you have those not so easy competences that you've mastered, then the most practical thing we could give the teacher is instruction in how to interview children and how to assess what they know. So there's another bag on the donkey that contains guidelines for interviewing children within the context of a classroom.
To develop the kinds of understanding and embodied understanding I was talking about, I think it's key for the teachers to think about and be able to develop experiences that let the students experience the phenomena that they're learning about. And then you just kind of learn a symbolic or more abstract characterization of that, which is more traditional schooling, to go along with that. But it's key to have the experiences there to ground the understanding in. Without that, in fact, philosophers talk about two different kinds of meaning, sense and reference. And you only have the sense kind of meaning, how ideas relate to each other. You also need the reference, how it relates to things in the world and interacts there. So that crafting of experiences for the students, they may have experiences, and that's actually part of the function of questioning them and interviewing them, like Herb was talking about, to find out, what they've experienced before that's related to what they're learning, that you could build upon and just refer to that to the extent that they don't have those things. And the more sort of impoverished background they come from, probably the less likely they are to have had the full set of experiences they need to relate to the schoolwork. And some things they're learning about, it's hard to directly experience, and that's actually where using things like computer simulations or even videos, interactive videos and things can come in to provide some of those direct interaction experiences. In fact, we've done an experiment with video games. It's an interesting video game called Civilization that's a historical simulation. And we've shown the students that have played that game into some level of expertise, if they then learn in a history class some of the history related to that, they don't learn so much of the history facts and stuff from the game itself, unlike what some people claim. But what it does is it gives them the experiences of grappling with historical issues that then they make much more sense and learn better about the history in a more formal learning setting in the classroom. And so that's where you're providing the experiences that then can relate to the more symbolic and abstract kinds learning experience they have. Even if they're just reading it from a chapter in a textbook, having played this game, they get much more out of the reading than they would have before. So developing these experiences, linking them together with the traditional kind of instruction, and finding out what they're bringing to them from questioning them and finding out what they know already and building upon that, I think are key skills and orientations that teachers need to have, and I talk about them in my classes.
A couple thoughts about Herb's donkey. Based on this morning's earlier discussion, the motivation the obligation to pay attention to students' thinking fits in the Michigan category of ethics, it seems to me. Teachers have to believe that they have the responsibility of doing that as part of instruction. It wouldn't necessarily be the case that they would have to do that. They could teach the course and kids would either learn it or not. And so that whole business of taking responsibility for paying attention to what the kids are learning on an ongoing basis is a big shift, I think, in the modal kind of instruction in American education compared to the last century. And so then the question of what makes it possible to do that is your second one, resonates with the discussion of the classroom routines. In order to do clinical interviews in an ongoing class or make observations that are equivalent to that, you have to have a way of making it possible for you to go look at or ask what's going on with individual kids in a class of 30 or whatever it is. So that's a real interaction between practice and knowledge. You can't apply the knowledge unless you can figure out how to find an occasion to pay attention to what it is you want to know.
Seems like it would segue nicely into what we're doing.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I mean, that's just a very concrete example of what teachers need to say to kids all the time. And it can happen in a group setting as well. You can have kids up at the blackboard demonstrating how they solve problems and ask them, how did you do that? Why? What does it mean when you wrote this number down right here? So doing clinical interviews is not limited to intensive clinical interviews with individual kids, the kind that I do, for example. But it should be an integral part of teaching. And I would argue, in a way, it is teaching. Finding out what kids know is the first step in teaching. And then finding out whether what you did had an effect on what kids know is the next part of teaching. So 6 magic words.
Nice, thank you. Those are magic words. There are situations, though, where when you ask somebody, how did you do that, they really can't tell you. And so I think my donkey is going to mine will be the most overloaded because we have the biggest machines. So, so we want those ways of being able to look inside what someone is doing and understand what are the mechanisms at play there. And then develop the frameworks and the knowledge that will allow us to extend that knowledge and help us capitalize on what's happening in the brain so as to facilitate learning for different populations and at different stages. I mean, for instance, if you ask a young child, how did they construct a sentence? They can't tell you. Actually, if you ask an adult, if you ask someone with a PhD in linguistics, how did you do that, right? That would be me, but I can't tell you how I do that. But we can look at some aspects of how we utilize that knowledge, how our brains biologically support that kind of cognition. And we can start to understand, how the knowledge has to be acquired, the impact of environment on the development of that knowledge, the impact of our actions in the classroom or in the home or in other environments too. I work in the speech pathology program, so I also work a lot with clinicians and remediation situations. And I think the donkey with the big machine on its back would be offering that additional layer of knowledge, of information, that will help us understand, even when the child can't tell us how they did something, will help us understand something about how they're doing it and how we can support that. And when we see something being successful in a teaching and learning environment, or when we see something failing, what we need to understand is not just that, okay, that's good, let's do that some more, or that didn't work, okay, I'm not doing that again. But why? What's the reason, right? What's the extended understanding of that? If we can start to develop more information about the mechanisms that underpin teaching and learning, then we can really start to be informed in our approaches. I think the accumulation of knowledge, of observations and self-reflections has been extraordinary, and that's really what's driving training of educators at the moment, this idea that by working directly with people who are skilled educators, that new teachers can learn so much about, what works, what's good. But for me, the most crucial part is, how is the new teacher going to be able to function when the skilled educator isn't there to answer their question? How do they develop a framework that allows them to answer those questions for themselves? And in order to do that, you really need the additional level of knowledge, right? Not just what you can see, but also what do those observations mean when they're put together. You need the theoretical frameworks for that. So that would be my donkey's contribution, I think. Yes.
Are these machines getting smaller as time goes on?
It depends which ones.
Which ones?
Yes.
Now, as moderator, I've succeeded admirably in getting these folks to talk and also in lowering the level of dialogue to donkeys and satellites. As my third accomplishment, I'd really like to invite you, as also you're our intellectual companions and our professional allies and so forth, to contribute. If you have questions, if you have some points you would like to make, or ways you'd like to connect this synapse between research and practice, just to draw upon a brain image, please chime in, because we have some more time, and part of our work here is dialogue with one another.
So the question was, I think, what's the relationship between trying to understand what a child knows and how the child solves problems to the issue of understanding the mathematics, the subject matter, whether it's mathematics or anything else? I think that knowledge of mathematics is obviously crucial. If you don't understand, or any other subject, if you don't understand what you're trying to teach, that's obviously no good, and we don't need research to make that point. What I find, so definitely teacher training has to include work in the content areas, but there was only so much room on my donkey, so, but it definitely should include the knowledge. What I found as very interesting in working with teachers is when I ask them to interview kids about certain concepts, the teachers then often learn the content themselves. So that in the process of interviewing, an idea comes out, oh, is 0 really a whole number or something? They start to think about those issues and learn some real content themselves. So that's an unintended, it's a good outcome of interviewing kids.
Yeah, actually, we've got a tablet-based thing for reading comprehension for young, like second graders and stuff. And what it is actually this was based on research done by another person, where they found that if you have the kids reading a story, say about a farmer and his animals and tractors and all that, and if they, what you want to be thinking about is not just processing the language, but also what's being referred to by the story. So if you have them play with some toys over here with the animals and so forth, then they understand it better. And then they also have to learn to visualize that happening when they're reading the story. Well, you can get rid of the toys and stuff and instead use an iPad or other tablet where you have the objects and the creatures and stuff and the setting being referred to and what you're reading, and the kids can, as they read through, can manipulate it on the screen. So if the farmer takes this tractor into the barn, you can have the farmer go over, get on the tractor and go over there. So now you don't have to lose the toys and stuff, that would have manipulatives there. And that works just as well. Okay, so I think this touch bait, the idea that you can have a touch interface where and the movements that you're making are conceptually congruent with the underlying ideas that you're trying to learn about. Okay, that's a big step forward, and that's the kind of stuff that so we got a whole bunch of little prototypes like that where we're developing and doing the research to show that they're effective and how to design them to be most effective. So, I think that's potentially a big leap forward. And what makes it the leap is the fact they can carry it around with them, and they can be sort of a part of them, and they can very directly interact with it, but with the touch and movement and stuff. And also it has sound and the visual stuff too, so it can have this full perceptual experience just right there on that little tablet. But then also it's key though, for the learning to happen when the kids also internalize that, so they're not dependent upon the tablet always. So eventually, after practicing this way, they go over and they just read the text and they can just do all this in their head. And then they've really got it. So I think that's this gestural touch-based interfaces and have the direct connection there together with the vision and sound, is very valuable and a very powerful tool for us.
Can I add something to that? John and I have worked together on some of these questions, and a lot of the work that we're doing actually builds on work that's come from John's field, and looking at the brain correlates of those kinds of mechanisms that are at play that he's observed using measures of behavior and change in behavior. And then we're sort of, doing the backfilling now that we have access to the technology that can help us understand that. We're looking at how is the brain supporting that behavioral change. And so, for instance, things like using tablets, using iPhones, these things are understood to be inherently motivating for children, that they're interested in interacting with material in that way. From John's work, we know that experiential learning is really crucial. And from the brain science side of things, we can actually see that activating the motivation and reward circuitry in the brain changes the ways that children allocate attentional and cognitive resources. So we can provide some sort of more objective ways of evaluating whether those approaches are effective. And so we've done some work on that. John and I, back in the day, maybe you don't even remember this study, it was probably a blip on your radar, but we looked at the difference in brain responses between avatar faces and photorealistic faces. You remember? That was when I first started at Teachers College, and John helped me to develop this study working with one of his doctoral students at the time. And we got some really interesting results there too, because we thought we knew that, people would rather interact with something that looks like a person. And that's also the kind of report that you get. People will tell you that that's what they prefer to do. But then when we actually looked at how the brain was responding to this kind of, rather basic avatar sort of face, as opposed to a more photorealistic face, that actually the allocation of attentional and cognitive resources was more focused towards the more basic representation. So in turn, that actually helps us to then structure these materials and this kind of approach in ways that we know can capitalize on how the brain is handling these learning situations. And then there are things that we can learn about how skills become internalized, right? So this is also a theme of the cognitive science work in this area, that if you experience something, you're able to internalize it and make it automatic, and sort of, in a way, we talk about taking ownership of that knowledge, right? Making it your own. But looking at how the brain responds to that kind of situation, we see really specific neural signatures of automaticity in responding. And we can start to quantify how much exposure is enough. How fast does the exposure have to happen? Are there times in your life when the exposure doesn't have to be as much, when we can manipulate those kinds of variables? And so we're looking, for instance, at literacy acquisition at different time periods in people's lives, and trying to understand how much experience do you need in order to tap into that kind of automaticity at the level of the brain. Because it's not just about being able to read fast, right? It's about having the neural shortcut, literally having those synapses that can talk to each other, that allow you to make something like reading fast enough to be useful. And then what are the pedagogical approaches that we can take that would support that what are the things that we're doing at the moment that maybe make it harder? So we can investigate those kinds of questions from the neuroscience side of things too.
Can I?
Yeah.
I have a. I'd like to follow up on your avatar as opposed to real face, and I'm going to go back to the donkey and the tractors and the farmers. Did you do any functional MRI studies? Is there any research out there that talks about the difference in young children as they hit a touch screen and maybe see an image of a farmer, or they drag the farmer over to the tractor? It's a different experience kinesthetically from going and playing with the manipulatives. Is there any research that you've done? Do you have any insight into the differences and the effectiveness, lack of effectiveness in terms of learning those two different kinds of experience?
Moving around a tractor on an iPad versus driving a tractor or something?
Oh, real,
like
well,
that,
I guess that would be even more motivating if I was 6.
Oh, they'd love that. Yes, I'm sure.
But let's talk about
Hard
the
to
little.
do in fMRI, though.
Yeah, let's talk about the little toys.
There have been studies recently looking at that. We're not doing fMRI work right here at this moment, but there have been some studies looking at the differences between actually, physically engaging, like holding an object in your hand, and directing something, or looking at a static image. The current understanding actually is that it's part of the embodied cognition framework, right? The current understanding is that you can embody even quite a static image. And so we have interesting findings where we see motor cortex being active in response to static images of objects that you use in a particular way. So a hammer, for instance, if you're looking at a picture of a hammer, you actually get motor cortex activation involving, dominant hand and arm areas. And it's suppressed movement. It's not that you're actually doing the movement, but your brain recognizes, in a sense, that, this is an object associated with an action, and all of that information, that related information, gets activated. And then what you do is make extremely fast decisions about which piece of information relevant to this object are you going to make? Are you going to activate the word for that object? Are you going to say the word out loud, or just think about it? Or you're going to put it in a sentence, or are you going to do the movement, do the motion? And so those are the kinds of connections that we see with respect to that any of these things can activate those different representations. And then you just make the decisions about, which aspects of the representation you need to use.
We had a question down here, so let me boil it down and say that what has been said up here sounds very individual from the perspective of classroom teaching. What can be said that is more about the social, the interactive, the collective dimension of teaching, which involves all of those in some way that's not just an aggregation of individuals? So that's for our panelists.
Isn't a lot of this trying to run away from that fact, Deborah, that it's social? In other words, isn't a lot of what we're talking about is trying to move back to the individual in some way in a social context, and that may be a mistake. But as I listen to it, at least, a lot of it is the ideal would be a tutoring situation, and so we can't do that. How can you arrange it so that would be a contrary reaction to what you're saying.
I feel like I've been talking too much, but I'm sort of interested in that issue, actually, because first of all, a lot of the work that we're doing in neuroscience, unlike the more behavioral research, actually we have to look at groups. So we have to, like I mentioned earlier, try and find the commonalities across populations. Rather than looking at this stage anyway, later we can find out more about individual variation. But there's also an emerging field called social neuroscience that's looking specifically at those aspects of the interaction. And I think Fritz is right, by the way, that we abstract away from social because social is complicated. It's hard to have a theoretical model of something that has so many variables built right into it, right? So we can't easily make a laboratory test for something that's social in its nature. So that's one reason why we do tend to abstract away from those kinds of interactions. But of course, it's really true that teaching is social, classrooms are social, learning is social. Everything takes place in a socio-cultural environment. And it's a crucial thing that we need to understand more about and model. And so that's what the social neuroscience piece is at the moment kind of trying to frame, so that we really can look at, what's the role of the social and cultural interactions, and how does that change what we see at the individual level when we can abstract to that level. Yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah, social and related to the cognition stuff, cognition is in a sense not completely individual either. It's a lot of the tasks and stuff that one accomplishes cognitively is a combination of people working together. In fact, as you said, that's mostly what goes on in the real world. And also the social situation is a good way of kind of getting out and expose the ways people have of thinking about things. So say if you're using, we have one of our computer simulations or something, sort of showing something and you're trying out things, interacting, having two or more people observing this and discussing amongst themselves what they think is going on there and what should be tried next and what the effect would be a way of getting the thinking out and expressed explicitly so that everybody can examine it and see how other people think about it and make it explicit. And also a major kind of embodiment of stuff are the kind of stuff you see us up here doing, namely all this gesturing and stuff. The gestures are a kind of language that links you into your non-linguistic representations of things and are crucial. Like we did a study years ago of people reasoning about configurations of gears, and we found a crucial aspect of that was them using their hands as like gears to both figure things out and communicate to the other people who are working on the problem with them. So that, that's a social kind of expression of this stuff, and also is involved in the reasoning. So I think all this is not meant to become, as you say, the accountability in a sense in our system is later to see the individual learning that takes place, but the social interactions and stuff are a crucial aspect of that.
So I think it's a very complicated issue. And here's one thought. It is true that ultimately we want individuals to learn. And part of what we want them to learn is how to interact with other individuals. No question about that. Okay. Sometimes it's true that some individuals don't learn well in a social setting. And they are odd, they are idiosyncratic, and sometimes they're brilliant. And for them, the social context may be less important than it is for other people. So social interaction is not necessarily a panacea for everything. It can be harmful. Some people get stepped on by other people. Of course, the teacher doesn't want that to happen and needs to deal with it, but social interaction can be bad sometimes. Social interaction, there's no contradiction between understanding what people think and having productive social interactions around that. For example, one really good classroom practice is to put a small number of kids in the front of the room, ask them to solve a problem, put their answers on the board, and if you pick the right kids and you're lucky, you might find that 3 kids get the same answer in different ways. Then we can have a discussion about why is that true? And what do you learn from another way of doing it? Another major, really interesting kind of social interaction revolves around conflict. Piaget claimed that social interaction that involves disagreement and argument is a wonderful way to learn. It's cooperation in the sense of, well, we're going to discuss our arguments rationally, we're not going to hit each other over the head, but it is conflict and disruption. So Deanna Kuhn, for example, studies argument a lot and finds that kids arguing about taking different position and arguing for the truth of that position, that's enormously complicated social interaction. So, yeah, maybe the world revolves around the kid, but then there are overlapping Venn diagrams where we have other kids interacting together and teachers, obviously, as well.
The question was that we have research that has helped to produce learning progressions in different content areas. Is there research that talks about learning progressions, about learning itself, the process of learning?
I don't think there's a lot. I think some people have studied teacher education from that perspective and teacher mentoring and that sort of thing, but I don't know the work. It's a good question and a reasonable thing to look at. That's all
No, I think in fact, when this was, we were talking about the avatars and stuff earlier, I realized that there's maybe a misconception we've gotten across here. And that is, in fact, the embodied cognition is that the fuller the perceptual experience, the better. And part of what we're saying is the technologies we have now are enabling us to give a fuller perceptual experience. But that in no way replaces real reality, okay, which is fuller than all of that, you know. In fact, I was struck when you started talking about multimedia. We got multimedia computers now. Well, you know, the world is multimedia already, so, you know, even more media. So we don't, and in fact, the best way to think about this, I think, is that we don't want to have the technology replace the real interactions, is they need to work together. And in fact, we've done studies. For instance, I did some stuff with kids learning about fish and tanks and, you know, and the biology and chemistry of that and so forth. And so you can have a desktop. The best learning environment we found in the study was where they had a desktop fish tank and stuff where they were doing, you know, feeding the fish and changing the temperature, oxygenating the water and measuring the pH and all that stuff, okay, on a small scale. But that's still not the real reality. And if we supplemented that, augmented that with a computer simulation that showed some of the dynamics of what the invisible stuff going on inside that fish tank was, and they could also manipulate that, and instead of waiting, you know, 2 weeks from now to see the effect of changing the temperature on the growth of the fish, you can do it immediately on the simulation, but you can also see what happens. And also then linking out over the internet to big fish tanks growing tilapia in a remote site, okay, to show how the desktop version and the simulation links to the even bigger reality, where you can see how you really wind up doing fish farms and hydroponics and so forth. So that was the magic combination, is doing all those things. So I think the technology should be thought of as augmenting reality. So it's augmented reality is the magic combination there. But there are things that it can do in terms of, you know, speeding up the time course, showing invisible things that are happening with forces in the chemistry and the atoms and so forth, that augments the real experience. But that doesn't replace, as you say, that doesn't give you a sense of how big the tractor is and what it smells like and all. You need that too. So it's the experiences, the real experiences together, augmented with the technology is what works the best. That's great.
One important answer to that is that a lot of this work requires, as we refine it and develop it, requires working in schools with teachers. Because if you're looking at progressions and formative assessment, the big question is, when you know where a kid is, what do you do about it? We have to either where there's a particular problem or they're just, what do you do next? And we're really short on the technology of the kinds of pedagogical reactions that are constructive given the information you have about where a kid is. And I think that work doesn't get done without doing it in real settings for the most part, a lot of it. And we have to find ways of capturing that as it happens. I was really interested in the Michigan description of what they're doing, because they're clearly getting a lot of experience about these kinds of issues, and there is a research component, and I assume they are trying to capture and codify what they're doing. But that would be a crucial contribution to knowledge about instruction, and that has to happen, it seems to me, out there, not be brought out there later.
And if I may, there's I think there's something that we can do at our end as well, because you're right that the theoretical approach is the kind of like the level of the research that I'm working at. For instance, it's currently quite far removed from practices in classrooms. What filters through to the classroom is stuff that the scientists aren't saying, right? Things like brain gyms and things like this, which is, explicitly not supported by the science, but it's falling into that communication gap that we have between what's happening with the research and what's happening in the classrooms, that educators want to have that knowledge, want to do things that are supported by the research, and that we're not currently bridging that gap effectively. And I think that a really crucial way that we can begin to do that is at the level of professional preparation for teachers, that accessing the research, even the brand new stuff, even the neuroscience and education stuff that is still working towards direct application, maybe even especially that, because it needs more of the impetus towards the application. It should begin during professional preparation. And it's not about taking a course in, research methods or a course in neuroscience or something like that. It's about really engaging with what this research is bringing to education and really making it the medium that we use to understand what it is we're doing when we're teaching. I think that, the picture that you showed earlier of the medical students, I thought that was such an interesting picture. And we were thinking about the knowledge that they have, that they're bringing to that practical hands-on situation. And what they know is how the cardiovascular system functions. And when they interact with that system, how they're changing it. And I don't think that that knowledge is available currently to teachers, and that's something we can do. If we do the learning research and then disseminate that from the earliest times in training, that I think is going to be crucial.
Can I say one thing about it? The study, all the studies I referred to were done in Harlem schools using the network that the Office of School and Community Partnerships here at TC maintains. It's been my thought that, I have no solution to your, to your problem here. You may know better than I do, but it seems to me that trying to develop research-based model programs so that other schools and teachers can see it actually functioning in the situations in the schools and having a positive effect is the best way to diffuse these innovations and things. Somebody's going to have to cough up the money to help do this, and the only thing to say is that the technology keeps getting cheaper and cheaper. So that's, everything, in the sense, that's moving in the right direction because of that. So like, the first tablet computers, cost like $400 or $500, and now we're beginning to get $200 ones and so forth and so on. And the kids already have a lot of smartphones themselves out there. We can put it on that too. We're about to do a project with WNET doing a fractions curriculum on smartphones. So, but I think, showing it, having a few model programs, showing it actually working in context in the schools is one approach we're trying to do.
Yeah, just John mentioned the magic word money, which is very important here. I think that what we need to do is have serious and extensive professional development within the context of schools, hopefully in collaboration with universities. And we need to give teachers resources and time to engage in real learning communities within a school. This is an old idea, but we don't seem to have the will or the money to do that. So it's not a question of simply disseminating the knowledge, it's helping teachers as a learning community to work with that knowledge, to understand it in their own terms that would be useful for their classrooms. So it's a major job, and I think we have right to be discouraged about whether that can actually happen in this country.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.